this. Okay, so hello everybody. This is Karen, and this is the Techniques of History with Melissa Barker, who will introduce herself. And I just want to let everybody know she has a handout that she's prepared that I am going to upload through the chat. So you will see a document there that then you have the ability to download and view. And I don't know exactly how you download and view it. I think you double click on it or something. So this is the first learning moment. So I will do that while Melissa introduces herself. Thanks, Melissa.
Thanks, Karen. And thank you for having me. I am very excited about presenting today. My name is Melissa Barker. I'm also known as the archive lady in the genealogy world. I am a certified archives manager. I work at the Houston County, Tennessee Archives. I'm also a professional genealogist. My expertise is in Tennessee records. Actually, this year, I retired from taking clients. I've been taking clients for the past 17 years. But I still speak and I write and I lecture and teach about researching in archives and records preservation. So today I thought that I would give you my presentation on That's in the Archives, digging deeper in archived records. I've listened to the other presentations so far in this conference, which have been fabulous, to the authors and everyone that has spoke. And I can see the theme of preserving our history and finding our history in archives and museums and all of the repositories that have these records. And so I thought this would be a good presentation for this conference. Before I get started, I wanted to really thank Ron for his presentation this morning, because he talked about a lot of things that is not unique to Alaska. It's unique in all areas of the country, of the world, who are trying to preserve our history. My own story is back in 2010. Houston County, Tennessee did not have an archives. We're not preserving our records that date back to 1871. And I got a phone call from our local librarian wanting to know if I'd like to be part of a group of people who had gotten permission from the county mayor to just clean out the county records vault that had the records in them. And all we were going to do is get together, clean out the vault, kind of organize it and leave it like it was. So we met in August of 2010. There were 6 of us. And we spent the first half of the day working on these, pulling out records that were, the boxes were torn, records were strewn all over the floor, very horrible shape. And we broke for lunch. And at lunch, we all were talking about the fact we needed some way to preserve our records. We needed a county archive. We all agreed on that. And then someone said, well, we need someone to head this up. And of course, many of you will understand the fact that everyone sat on their hands, because these 6 people were also the ones that were volunteering at all kinds of organizations in our small county. And so they already had full plates. And they turned to me and they said, Melissa, you do genealogy research. Why don't you do this? And I said, I am not an archivist. I've never done archives work. I work in archives as a genealogist, but I've never been an archivist. So they prodded me on and I got to looking into it. And we are very, very fortunate in the state of Tennessee that we have the Tennessee State Library and Archives. And they offer what is called an Archives Institute. It's a 3-year program where they educate our county archivists across the state. So I went back to school at the age of 42, became an archivist. 2011, our county hired me as our first ever archivist, and I started from scratch. And so 10 years later, we have made great strides. But talking about Ron's talk this morning, and what he talked about is getting people involved, and especially when he talked about the local government officials. One of the things that I had to overcome was the fact that in our small county, nobody knew what an archives was. They didn't even know what the word meant. They didn't know what I did. And so one of the things that I did, and it's kind of difficult in our day and time now with COVID, but one of the things that I started doing is every year I would have an open house. And that first year I invited all of our county officials. And what I did is, it was an election year actually, so they all came. And what I did is I pulled records that related to their family and I had them on display. And I had the meeting, I had the open house on the night when they were having a meeting, a commissioner's meeting after my open house. So they had to be in the courthouse. And so it really got them excited about seeing the records for their family. In fact, they had to stop the county commission meeting and send someone down to get one of the county commissioners from our archives, which is in the basement of our courthouse, to come and take a vote because he was still down there looking at records. So that's one aspect that you might try. You also talked about getting young people into the Historical Society and into these groups. One of the things that I do every year is that I participate in Professions Day at our local elementary schools. And I bring all kinds of stuff from the archives. And I am one of the more popular tables that the kids like to come to. They like to see the cursive writing in the books. They think it's a foreign language. But, you know, I participate in things in our community and I bring out the records, the artifacts and things and let them see them and touch them. I think children learn better and they get very excited about history when they can actually see the documents and actually touch the documents. So that's my little thing about Ron's talk. I was very excited to hear Ron speak about what he spoke about. So let's get started with my presentation. I'm going to full disclosure, I've never been to Alaska and I've never researched in Alaska records. Anyone, if you talk to my family, though, they will tell you from a very young age, one of my dreams is to be snowed in a cabin in Alaska. I have always said that. I don't know why, but so this is great that I'm giving this presentation to your group. So you're going to be seeing a lot of records from the archives where I work and also from my personal genealogy. And so don't let that deter you because they're not Alaskan records. I want you to think about this presentation in a grand scale and think about any and all repositories that are out there. So one of the first things I cover is what is an archive. Now, to a lot of you, you're thinking, I know what an archive is, but you would be extremely surprised that when I give this presentation to any society across the United States, a lot of people thank me because now they understand what an archive is. When I had been doing genealogy for 32 years now, and when I became an archivist, and started working with genealogists 10 years ago, I realized the fact that many of our genealogists and historians do not understand what archives are, what they hold, the fact that our records are literally anywhere. And so that's kind of been my mission, to teach and lecture about archives and to tear down the curtain in archives and show people the records. So the Society of American Archivists defines an archive as an organization that collects the records of individuals, families, and other organizations. Now, this is a very broad definition, but it is straight to the point. Archives collect everything. I like to say there's an archive out there for everything. And so archives are there to collect and preserve whatever they're there to collect and preserve. And so archives are literally everywhere. Now, they may not have the word archive on the building, and they may not have the word archive in the title of their organization. But if they collect and preserve any type of records, photographs, artifacts, memorabilia, ephemera, anything, they are an archive. And so we should be using them for our research. And whether you're a genealogist, you're a historian, you're a writer, I've enjoyed listening to the authors speak during this conference. We should be using all of the archives available to us. So I'm going to talk about some types of archives. I work in a county archive. So that's one of the first ones I'm going to talk about. I understand Alaska doesn't have counties, they have boroughs, just like Louisiana has parishes. And so think about those as a county archive. But I work in a county archive, the Houston County, Tennessee archive. And many of these government, county, borough, and parish archives, they manage the county government records first and foremost. That's what I do. I'm required to spend 95% of my time on county government records. These are the records that are produced each and every day in our county government offices. We have retention schedules that are set forth by Tennessee state law, and other states have the same thing. They have retention schedules. And we have to go by those, which tells us which records are permanent, meaning you have to keep them forever, which records are temporary, which meaning you keep them for so many years and then they're allowed to be destroyed or transferred to an archive. And so we manage these county government records. I'm responsible for our county government records. So not only am I the archivist, I'm also my county's records manager. which is a great thing to be both, because many times if you have a records manager that is not an archivist, they may not understand that some of these records that are deemed temporary and after so many years can be destroyed, they're actually genealogical in nature or historical in nature and actually should be kept and transferred to an archive. County archives could also collect and preserve local historical records. And I put in parentheses, but not always, because you're going to find that many of these county government archives, a lot of them don't preserve local and historical records, many times because there's already a historical society or some other entity in the area that is doing this, and so they choose not to. In my case, I am the only archive in our county, and so I chose to collect and preserve local genealogical and historical records, and also because I'm a genealogist. I just think it's extremely important. So I have a dual job in doing both of these. Many of these types of archives are funded by county government. My county archive is actually in our county budget. I'm grateful and thankful for that. But as you can imagine, I have to fight tooth and nail for everything that I need for my archive. I have been extremely fortunate that our county mayor has been 110% on board with our archives. And the new administration that was elected in 2018, I actually spoke with him yesterday. He actually has the family search app on his phone and does genealogy research. So that was very exciting for me to know. But getting your county government, your local government on board with your archives, your museums, or anything you're trying to do can be very difficult. But don't give up. Use ways to find ways to, get them interested. But the main thing is education. I have found that I continually have to educate our local government officials about what I do, how I do it, and the fact that it needs to be funded. A lot of these government archives, county archives, may actually be funded by donations and run by volunteers. There's a county that is next door to us that is totally funded by donations and is totally operated by volunteers. The county does not give them, other than a building, they don't give them any other financing. A government county archive should not be confused with any other local archives. I find this happens with myself, with our archives. They are usually totally separate from a historical society, separate from a museum or any other archive in the area. And so if you're doing research, whether as a historian, an author, or a genealogist, once you have done research at a particular archive, don't think that's the only one, that they may have all the records there. Look in the community to see what other archives are available that have records. Another type of archive are historical and genealogical societies. If they have a building with records in them, I consider them an archive. You may find that there is a historical society in the area. You may find that they have a genealogical society in the area. And then there's some areas that have combined the two and have a historical and genealogical society. We have an historical society here where I live. I am the youngest person in our society, and I don't mind saying I'm 52 years old. We do not have a building. We don't collect records. We are one that we just meet once a month and have a speaker. But you may find in the areas where you're doing research that there are historical and genealogical societies that have records, and so they are a type of archive. They also collect and preserve historical records. Many times that's where all the records go to. Even government records get transferred to the Historical and Genealogical Society simply because there's no place else to put them. And so that's why our historical and genealogical societies are extremely important to not only genealogy research, but protecting and preserving our local and state history. You're going to see in my presentations, I share a lot of documents and photographs from my own genealogy, but also from the archives where I work. This one here is actually a receipt for Jesse Glasgow. This is my husband's third great grandfather, where he paid for a subscription to the Cumberland City Academy in 1891. He was very, very much a promoter of education. Another thing about historical and genealogical societies, which I have seen by watching these presentations yesterday and today, The members are very knowledgeable about local history and also where to find the records. One of the challenges that we have as researchers is trying to find where the records are located. Many times they're nicely preserved and archived in archives or historical and geological societies, and sometimes they're not. Sometimes they're still in attics, they're still in closets, they're still in an old abandoned government building. And so trying to find out where those records are located is kind of half the battle. And many times these historical and genealogical society members can help you with that. They can also help you with understanding and learning about the local history. Many of them have lived there their whole lives, and they know exactly what has happened. So talking to these members, I think, is very important. Our local public libraries are another type of archive. I have found that genealogists over the years have found that they don't go to libraries as much, and they don't see them as a type of archive that could have records that will help them. And so don't discount those local public libraries. They could actually have genealogy rooms, or maybe even parts of their collections on their shelves is genealogical or historical in nature. And so look for these public libraries, look for those collections that may be on the shelf. Maybe they have what are called special collections. These are those loose papers maybe that they have been donated to the library. Maybe it's just a collection of historical and genealogical books that are in a particular section of the library. We should not discount our local public libraries, and we should be supporting each and every one of them, because again, they too have to struggle with the local county budgets and have to fight for whatever they get as well. Local public libraries also have reference materials that are genealogy related. I have been noticing, even at my own public library, that many of the reference materials, the things that we, as I call older people, remember, such as dictionaries and encyclopedias, and a lot of those reference materials are being taken out of libraries due to the internet. And granted, we can find a lot on the internet, but there are a lot of things that are still in our books that we should be looking for. And so while I understand libraries are making room for other things, it's kind of sad for me to see these materials being taken out of libraries. I'm a book person. I do not particularly care to read ebooks, Kindles. I want to hold my book. I want to mark in my book. I want to, make notes. I want to underline things. So I'm a book person. So I love libraries and I love books. A next kind of archive that I like to tell you about is state archives. I like to call these mega archives because they contain a tremendous amount of records. This photograph here is actually the Tennessee State Library and Archives. This photo is from about 1953, not too long after this particular building was built, as you can tell by the wonderful cars out in front. And actually, just this past April, we opened a brand new building of the Tennessee State Library and Archives, which we're very excited about. I call this my home away from home. I only live about an hour and a half away from Nashville, Tennessee. And I did all my client work here. This is where I attended the Archives Institute and received my certification in archives management. And so this building is extremely important to me. I put some red arrows there to tell you a little story. When I was attending the Archives Institute back in 2013, we had been working on the Tennessee Supreme Court records. When I say working on, we were cleaning them, we were flattening them, putting them in file folders, getting them ready for researchers. And so they asked us on one of our class days if we would like to take a tour of where the Tennessee Supreme Court records were being stored. And of course, we all wanted to see it. And so they put us on the elevator. It took us to the top floor of the building that you see here. And when the elevator opened and we stepped out, as far as we could see, all we could see were shelves full of boxes, which were the Tennessee Supreme Court records. So the Tennessee Supreme Court records took up this whole top floor. And that wasn't all. They had more that was stored in an offsite storage area. The Tennessee Supreme Court records is a multi-year project that the TSLA is working on to process them and have them available for researchers. The state archives is also where the state or the archives, they preserve the state government records. I actually included a photo that I found online of the Alaska State Capitol House chambers in Juneau. So just like county archives, the state archives, their main job is to archive the state government records, which, I mean, if you're doing historical research, if you're doing genealogical research, you may can find your ancestors in these records as well. I actually found my husband's third great grandfather that I just showed you a document, Jesse Glasgow. I found him in some records that were the state election records, that where he actually ran for office in 1865. And the only reason why I found this piece of information was because that particular election in the county where he ran was contested, and it went all the way to the state level. And so it was in the state government records. So that was a pretty neat find. Unfortunately, his third great grandfather only received 4 votes in the election. He didn't win, but they were reporting all of the results of the election. So that's why he was included in these state records. These state archives could have county government records. And the reason I say that is because a lot of our state archives make it their goal to collect records from across the state that they represent. Also, many of our county governments had nowhere to put their records at times before they had a county archive, before a historical society. And so they would transfer these records to the state archives for safekeeping. And so if you can't find what you're looking for at the local level, I would encourage you to go to the state archives and see if they have the records you're looking for a particular county, a particular parish, like if you're doing research in Louisiana and of course in boroughs in Alaska. State archives also collect historical records and artifacts from across the state that they represent. One of the things that I find genealogists don't get a full grasp of is that a state archives actually has something there from every area of their state. And they are really active about preserving records from across the state. Interestingly enough, when the Tennessee State Library and Archives moved all of their records from the old building to the new building, it gave them a chance to kind of go through some of their records that they have not gone through in many, many years. And one of the things that they did is they repatriated a lot of records back to some of the counties that since the time had developed a county archive. And so I actually got a visit from an official from the Tennessee State Library and Archives. They brought us a wonderful document that they had in their records and gave it back to us for our county archives because we had formed a county archives 10 years ago. At the state archives level, this is also where records conservation and preservation takes place. They have usually their own conservator, on staff. And that's where they take care of any records that they have in their collections. But it's also a place that genealogists, family historians, anyone who is interested in preserving records, if you have something that maybe needs some preservation, I would encourage you to contact the state archives and talk to the conservator there on staff. And I'm sure they can give you some advice. They may even be able to give you a name and a contact information of someone who can help you with whatever records preservation you're dealing with. And I'm threw in a picture of the Alaska State Library, Archives and Museum in Juneau. I've heard this mentioned and referenced many times already in this conference. Another type of archive I wanted to cover was the university and college libraries and archives. I find genealogists, maybe not as much historians or writers, but genealogists don't think about these as much for genealogical records, and we should be. Of course, they're going to archive the college records and student records. So if you have an ancestor that went to a particular college, there may be records there for you that you can retrieve. I was actually able to retrieve a record for one of my husband's ancestors who was a doctor and attended Vanderbilt University in Nashville in the 1890s and received his degree. It wasn't very much of a record, but it was something to prove that he actually did go to school there. So don't forget those colleges and university library and archives. One thing that people don't realize is that these repositories could also house local historical records, genealogical records, and artifacts. If you think about the nature of a college or a university, is they're part of the community. and they love being part of the community. If that community doesn't have a county archive or a historical society or a local repository where citizens can donate their records to or leave their records to, a lot of times they end up at a college or university. I know a local university that has diaries from the Civil War that they house in their libraries. And so while that's not college related, it is local historical related. And so a lot of times these records end up at these colleges and universities. Also remember that many of these colleges and universities have more than one library and more than one archive on their campus. And so check them all out. Look for records everywhere you can look for records. They receive donations of historical and genealogical records, just like any other archive. They also have very strict standards of what they'll accept and what they won't. But it never hurts as a researcher to check any and every source that you can to look for the records that you want to find for a genealogical project, if you're writing a book, or if you're just doing some kind of local history research. This is a photograph of the Pogue Library at Murray State University in Kentucky. This is actually probably about an hour and 15 minutes away from me. Back many years ago when I was working with a client, I had to go to this library to retrieve some Kentucky obituaries that were on microfilm. I actually had made 2 discoveries at this particular library. It's a beautiful library, as you can see from this photograph. I took this photograph and I only got the one end of it. There's a whole nother end that's just as big as this one. And the first discovery I made was one of those newfangled microfilm machines. I had been used to the old-fashioned crank microfilm machine, but what I was introduced to was one of those microfilm machines that we have today that was hooked up to a computer that, as I found records, I could actually email them to myself, or I could download them to a thumb drive and take them with me. So that was my first discovery. But my second discovery were vertical files. And as I had finished my project, what I was there to do, I started looking around the room, and I'm very sad I didn't get a picture. I need to go back and get a picture of the other side of the room. But there were filing cabinets around the perimeter of the room, and there was no labeling on them. But being the nosy kind of genealogist historian that I am, I started looking in the filing cabinets. There was nobody else in this entire room but me. And I noticed that they were filled with file folders that had documents in them for surnames, other documents for local businesses. And so I went out and asked the clerk to explain to me what this collection was, and she introduced me to vertical files. And so I'm going to talk a little bit more about vertical files here in a minute, so I won't talk about it now. But if you're not using vertical files as part of any research you're doing, you're missing out on a great resource. And I also included a photo of the Elmer E. Rasmussen Library in Fairbanks. I've heard that talked about already in this conference. Another type of archive, which I think you'll be happy to see, is museums. I came late to the idea of doing research in museums. I always thought of museums as something that you visited on vacation. Or when I was in school, we would take trips to museums during a school day. But I came late to the idea of using museums for genealogical research and for historical research. They will have exhibits and displays of artifacts and documents. I've actually heard of a genealogist that found their ancestors' documents on display at a museum. And so museums are a type of archive when you think about the definition of an archive. I like to say that museums have a front room and a back room. Their front room, of course, is where they have the exhibits and displays, where we as patrons walk through, look at all of the things that they have on display. But they also have back rooms, just like a regular archives. Their back rooms consist of boxes of documents and photographs and artifacts. And so if you see a letter on display, more likely there's probably more where that came from, or a photograph on display, or a scrapbook, or a diary. You are probably going to find more of that in those back rooms. They can contain archived records in these back rooms that are not on display. And so that's why I consider museums a type of archive and a place that's something we should consider to trying to do research and find records. This is one of my absolute favorite museums. This is the Williamson County, Tennessee Museum and Archives. This is one of their displays. I absolutely love this. When I took this photograph, I could not actually get everything in the photograph because they had so much in this particular display. They have fantastic exhibits and displays, but they also have a fantastic archives of what they don't have on display. This is what it looks like in their back room, part of it anyway, and they have boxes of records just like a regular archive. I grabbed this off the internet. This is the Alaska Veterans Museum in Anchorage. Looks like a fantastic museum. Military museums are phenomenal about collecting records and documents, photographs, and artifacts to share with their patrons. Before I leave museums, let me say that they can be difficult if you're wanting to do research like you do in a regular archive. It depends on the archive. It depends on the museum curator, what they allow the researcher to see and to gain access to. But I think that if you will show them how serious you are, the serious researcher you are, explain to them what you're researching. Do not give them the 3-hour story of your family, but talk to them about specific things you're looking for, and develop a relationship with a museum. I think maybe over time you could gain access to some of their records and things that they have in their back rooms. And so you may have to work a little harder with museums, but we should not discount them. They are extremely important to our local history, to our collective history, and we should be supporting them, and we should be using them for research. So another type of archive I wanted to move to is church archives. Church archives can be very valuable to researchers, no matter what you're researching. Normally, these particular types of archives are organized by denomination or type of religion. And so this particular photograph is one that a friend of mine actually is the archivist at. This is the historical foundation of the Cumberland Presbyterian Church and the Cumberland Presbyterian Church in America. This particular archive is located in Cordova, Tennessee, which is just outside of Memphis. Many people, when I talk about this particular archive or I talk about church archives, they think, well, I don't have ancestors in Tennessee, so I don't need to look at this particular archive. Well, one of the things that I know by talking to my friend Susan Knight Gore, who's the archivist there, is that her and her husband get into their minivan and they travel from state to state visiting Cumberland Presbyterian churches. And they are called upon to come by, pick up the old records or records that they don't have room for anymore. And then they pick them up and bring them back to this archive. So many of these church, especially the denominational and religious type archives, collect records from all over and bring them back to a centralized archive. And so just because this archive is in Tennessee, don't discount the fact that if your family or you're researching any kind of history having to do with the Cumberland Presbyterian Church, records could be here for you. They archive records from the local church at one facility. Like I said, they gather these records and take them back to one facility. Also, don't forget that many individual churches have their own archive, their own library, and they may have their collections at the local level. And so I talk to local churches all the time when I'm researching my own family. I actually contacted a church in Wyandotte County, Ohio, where my Barth family actually came there in 1854. Very interesting and rare family that they stayed in that particular area for over 100 years. Many families that I researched move around. And so I contacted the church there that they were affiliated with. And I was very, very fortunate that the church secretary was actually related to the same family. And so she actually sent me a very huge packet of all kinds of documents and information. She even went to the trouble of taking pictures of the church and taking pictures of the pulpit in the church, because my ancestor, Christian Barth, actually helped to build the church, but also built the pulpit that they use even today. And so she actually went to all that trouble and sent me some fantastic information. One thing to also keep in mind is that many of our church leaders, pastors, schools, Sunday school teachers may have taken some of these records home with them. And a lot of times these records will end up in their personal papers. And then if those personal papers are donated to an archive, you may find something there. I actually had that happen to us in our archive. Miss Lola Knight, who was a local school teacher in our area for decades, her family donated a lot of her personal papers, documents, photographs, and artifacts to our archive. And as I was going through them, I found a couple of Sunday school membership ledgers from the local Methodist church where she attended. It had lists of people who were members of the church, when they came to the church, when they may have left the church, when they moved, became a member of another church. So these were in her personal papers. And so looking for these church records in the pastor's papers, or even a person who just attended the church, may be something that will help you. I wanted to also mention another great church archive is located in downtown Nashville, Tennessee, the Southern Baptist Historical Library and Archives. If you have Southern Baptist in your ancestry, or if you're doing any kind of research on the Southern Baptist, this is a fantastic archive. I've been there several times. And like I said, they collect records from the Southern Baptist denomination from across state lines, not just in Tennessee. And so keep that in mind. Another type of archive are regional archives. These are fantastic archives to learn about a particular region. They archive records about certain region of a country or of a state. And so they're great. They highlight a particular culture in that region. One of the things that I do as a genealogist and as a historian is I'm always researching the culture that my ancestors lived in, were part of. And so these are great archives to find that kind of information. Regional archives can actually encompass more than one state within that region, and I'm talking about the United States. And so that's why it's important to try to look for these types of archives. This is a great example. This is the Archives of the Appalachia. And if you know anything about the Appalachian region, it encompasses more than one state. And so this is why it's great to have this type of archive. This archive is actually located at the East Tennessee State University. And I have some fantastic records to help you understand the culture of the region. And they have records about individuals. And so it's a great archive. Another archive, and one of the last archives I'm going to talk about, is ethnic archives. These are phenomenal archives to do research in. They collect and archive records for a particular race of people. I think they're vital to our collective history as well as our genealogy. They concentrate on the history and the culture and lives of particular ethnic groups. They're fantastic that way. And they're learning centers. I have found that many of our ethnic archives are learning centers for the diverse groups of people that are found in our lineage and in our history. This is a really great ethnic type archive. This is the Museum of the Cherokee Indian in Cherokee, North Carolina. If you have Cherokee ancestry, this would be a great archive for you to tap into and to look into for learning about the Cherokee heritage. Now, you may not find records specifically for those people that you're researching, but one of the things that I find when I do my genealogy research is that I want to know about the people. I want to know everything about the people, and that includes any ethnic heritage that they may have. If it's Cherokee, or if it's Irish, if it's Jewish, I want to know about that. One of our newest, and I say our, meaning the United States, one of our newest ethnic archives that is out there that I cannot wait to go and visit, because they open, I think, just before COVID hit. The National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C. I've heard phenomenal things about this particular archive and museum. So I'm hoping one day to actually visit this place. But if you have African American ancestry, this is a place I would suggest that you seek out to learn about that heritage and that history. So hopefully I've given you an overview of archives. Now, there is no way I could tell you about every single kind of archive that's out there, but records can literally be anywhere. One of the things I teach people is to ask the question, where are the records? When you're researching in a particular city, a particular state, a particular region, ask the question, where are the records? Because you're going to find them in places that you think you would never, ever find them. One of those places may be at a local historian's home. Here in Tennessee, it is a law that each county has a local historian, a named and approved local historian. And so we have local historians here where we live. And the one that we had several years ago was Nina Finley. She actually died in 2014, but she was our local county historian for many, many years. And upon her death, her son called me a few weeks after her death and asked me if I would like to have all of her research records that were in her attic. Of course, we said yes. But when we said yes, we did not realize that it was going to take 2 truckloads to get those records to our archive. And so this is a photograph I took on that day, and it's not of all of the records, but this is what I call fresh from the attic. As you can see, they're still in their original boxes. Yes, we found some dead rodents and some evidence of, the bugs and things like that, but we have since reboxed everything and cataloged everything, but you never know where records are going to be found. That's why I tell genealogists, historians, whomever is doing this type of research, to never give up, because there are always records being found in homes, in old buildings, in places where you never would think of, and donated to archives or coming to light in the historical community. How about finding records at the local electronics store? My husband and I were actually out for a drive, and we stopped at a local electronics store. My husband needed some piece of electronic equipment, and it was in a very, very small town. And so it was locally owned. It wasn't a chain. It wasn't a chain. It was locally owned. So I went in and I was just browsing around, and I noticed a display case that the owner of the store had. And in that display case, he had artifacts, local historical artifacts, and some photographs. And there was a ledger in there dating back to the 1800s. And I asked him why he has this in his store, and he said that it belonged to his family. I actually encouraged him to donate it to the local archive, but people still want to keep their things that belong to them, and I understand that. But it was a local store ledger dating back to the 1800s, where it had all the local people that had accounts at that particular store. And so it was a particularly great find. I encouraged him to try to let the local historical society digitize it, some way get this information out to the historical community, because I think it's important that these types of records not be under lock and key, or an electronic store maybe, but to be shared. And so it was a neat find to find at an electronics store. You might find these kinds of records on online auction sites. I kind of scour these sites as an archivist looking for things for my archives. We don't have a very big budget. And so we have the local historical society that actually has stepped up. And whenever I find something, or another historical member that works with me on this, we find something on an online auction site, we petition our local historical society to pay for it. And so far, they've been really great to step up and pay for things like documents and photographs. One of the last things that we purchased was a railroad accident report. We had the Louisville and Nashville Railroad that ran through our county, and it was an accident report from 1964 that was on eBay. How it got there, how it got to that person, I have no idea. But we purchased that off of eBay. It was $10, but the Historical Society stepped up, paid for it for us to have in our archives. Things that we find, like postcards and local business memorabilia, it feels great to bring it back to where it once started. Personal papers. This is another reason why our research, no matter what kind of research we're doing, is never completed. It's because people still hold things in their personal papers, in their homes, in their businesses, even organizations, that could be vital to our research. And so hopefully these will be donated to a local archive or be shared in some way, so that the information can be used to help to tell our local history, or to help us with our genealogy research. So where do we start? One of the things that I teach people is that you need to start locally. Get as local as you can, whether that's at the city level, the county level, whatever it is that helps you to get to that local level. Now, this is actually a map from the Tennessee State Library and Archives, their archives development portion on their website. One of the things that Tennessee, and the reason I use Tennessee a lot is because that's just my expertise, that's what I know. Tennessee has been extremely instrumental in trying to make sure each and every one of our 95 counties has a county archive. Now, they don't fund them, they only support them with help in helping to set one up, training archivists, and helping them in any kind of records preservation that they need. But this shows you right here that the blue counties are the counties that have a county archive, which is a lot. The white counties are the counties that don't have an archive yet, and the green counties are what they call, they have a partial archive, whether maybe they don't have an archivist or they're not fully up and running yet. The little star there is showing you where I'm located, but we need to get to the local level. And I actually wanted to throw in the map of Alaska, your borough map. And so, like I said, I'm not familiar with Alaska records. And so, getting down to that local level, I've heard some of the talks and talking about different kinds of museums, archives, and libraries, repositories. So it was really great to hear that. Locate and document every place where there are records being archived. Now, like I said before, it may be an archive that has the word archive in their title. It may be a historical society, but it may truly be a closet in the courthouse where they're storing their old records. I actually went looking for a court record back about 10 years ago at a local courthouse. They did not have a county archive yet. Thankfully, they have a county archive now. But at that time, I was looking for a court record for my ancestor's third great grandfather, George Washington Stringfield, who had been shot and killed. And the clerk for the courts took me down to this closet. She opened the closet. It was larger than a regular closet, but it was still a closet. She opened the door and she said, "Here you go." And when I walked in, all of their old court books and boxes of records were just scattered everywhere. And she says, "Help yourself." And she shut the door and left me there all by myself. And so I went through boxes and boxes of records and big ledger books. I finally found what I was looking for, but I remember thinking to myself, oh, these records need to be preserved, or they need to be more accessible. And thankfully, it wasn't too long after that that particular county got an archive, and they now are in an archive. So spend some time talking to the local historian, the local archivist, librarian, the museum curator, historical society members, genealogical society members. Talk to them about their history, where their records are located. I've even been known to call up the local Chamber of Commerce. I've also been known to ask some of the historical society members, who's the oldest person that has lived there their whole lives, that still has their mind that I could talk to. Because talking to these people, they live there every single day. They know what's going on. And so I can ask them the question, where are the records? Where do they keep the records? And they're going to know. If you go to a courthouse or a county government office and you ask them, a lot of times they're not going to know, because they're doing the work of today. They're helping people get their driver's license, get their marriage certificates, whatever it is, that their deeds. And a lot of them don't know where the old records are. And a lot of times you may even get the answer, oh, they were thrown away, when really they're just in an old building that the county is keeping all their records in. So it's important that we ask and we talk to the locals who know where these records are located. When you're doing research online, make sure and bookmark those websites for these local archives. I have found that many times these websites change. Sometimes they just disappear altogether. And so it's important that you bookmark what you find. And so that way you can go back to it, especially if you're researching in a particular area, if you're working on a particular historical project or your genealogy, and they have been in the area for a good long time, you're going to want to go back to those websites over and over. And so make sure and bookmark them so you don't lose them. Years ago, I can remember finding something on the internet and then continue my research and then thinking, oh, wait, where did I find that at? And I had not bookmarked it or even made a source note of where I had found it. Once you've gone to that local level, the city, the county, the parish, borough level, then if you still are looking for what you're looking for, I like to say you need to go to the next level. And the next level is what I say is the state archives. I am very partial to state archives. I have made a tremendous amount of research success at state archives. So all 50 US states have a state archives, which is fantastic. All 50 US state archives have a website. Now, some are more robust than others. Some have more on them than others, but they all have a website. And so it's important for us to thoroughly search those websites and develop a relationship with the state archives wherever you're researching. I try to hone in on a particular archivist at one of these archives, someone I can email or call, or if I get to visit, talk to and ask for by name. If you can develop a relationship with someone like that, first of all, they may be more likely to help you because you've developed that relationship, but also because you have a contact point. They know, maybe they kind of remember maybe what you're researching, and they can help you. These state archives might actually be able to help you go back and find local archives or places where the records are located in a local area. Because at the state archives level, they are usually working with all of these counties and cities with their records on some sort of level. And so they may know where those records are being stored or located. Also at the state archives level, I mentioned this once before, but this is where the records preservation and conservation is handled. I get questions as an archivist all the time about records preservation. And a lot of times, a lot of it is very easy to handle, but sometimes I have to refer them to a conservator, and I always refer people back to their state archives. Now, they may not be able to actually do the work for you, but like I said, they probably have a contact name for you that can actually help you. So let's dig deeper in some of the archived records. I hope that I have showed you about archives. I hope that I've showed you the excitement that I have for archived records, and I want to show you some. These collections I'm going to show you, in my opinion, since I've been working with genealogists since the last 10 years as an archivist, it's been very interesting going from being a genealogist working in archives, working and researching in archives, to being an archivist working with genealogists. I've learned a lot. And one of the things I've learned is that genealogists, there are a lot of records collections that they don't even look at. Maybe it's because they don't know about them. Maybe they're intimidated by them. But when they come to my archive to do research, I constantly find myself suggesting these particular collections. And they'll say, oh, I don't even know what those are. And so I get to introduce them to these collections. And so this is why I'm very passionate about these particular collections. And the first one is manuscript collections. In Canada and in Europe, you're going to find these called FONDS collections, FONDS. And in some libraries, they're called special collections. These collections, in my opinion, are the #1 underutilized records collections by genealogy researchers. Now, I find that authors and historians use these more, but I find that they don't use them to their full potential. These are fantastic records collections, and they can be just a little more difficult to use, as opposed to looking up an index online or something. May take a little bit of work on your part, but believe me, it will pay off. Manuscript collections are a gold mine for genealogical, historical, and organizational records. I get asked all the time to a layman's definition for a manuscript collection. So this is what I tell people. Think in your mind's eye about all of the historical or genealogical records you have in your possession. That could be documents, photographs, grandma's diary, the family Bible, Aunt Peggy's quilt that she made. It could be that baptismal certificate, anything, scrapbooks, diaries. Take all of that stuff and put it in boxes. Take those boxes down to your car and drive to the local archive and hand it over and donate it. That is a manuscript collection. So that tells you that literally anything could be in a manuscript collection. This is an example of a manuscript collection for my husband's third great grandfather, Jesse Glasgow. Now, I found out about this collection by happenstance, actually. I was attending the Archives Institute. I was in class. The lady sitting next to me, who was going to school to be an archivist manager too, for the county next to where I live, raised her hand and asked a question. She said that they had this collection of records that was in a box of other records that didn't belong to the other records in the box, and they didn't know how to archive them. So she was asking the question about how to archive these records. And then she dropped the name Jesse Glasgow, and I literally just about fell out of my chair. And so I couldn't say anything at the moment because we were in class. And so after class, I talked to her and I said, "What are these records you're talking about that you have for Jesse Glasgow?" And she proceeded to tell me that she had this envelope that was full of about 60 to 70 individual original records. So I told her, I said, when you get back to the archive, I want you to scan and send me copies of everything. And so this is actually a scan of the envelope that the records were in. It is dated, it says deeds on it, and it says died March 1892. Well, Jesse Glasgow did die in March of 1892. This envelope was full of somewhere between 60 to 70 individual receipts, invoices, some original Civil War pension records, because he was with an Illinois regiment, a Union regiment. And so fantastic records that I could not have found in anywhere else. So here's a couple of examples. This is a receipt from the E.E. Collison Jr. Portrait and landscape photographer. He was a very well-known photographer at the time in our area. It's dated September 29th, 1886. The interesting thing about this particular receipt is that Jesse Glasgow bought a photograph. Had a photograph taken, bought a photograph. I do not have a photograph of Jesse Glasgow. And so seeing this makes me now think, well, is it a photograph of himself, of one of his grandchildren? Did he purchase a photograph? You know, now I want to know what the photograph's about. But this is a fantastic receipt. This particular document actually sent me down a rabbit hole. And if you are interested at all about going down a rabbit hole, be my guest. You can do this. This is actually a Louisiana state lottery ticket dated June the 9th, 1888. First of all, I never even knew that there were state lotteries back in 1888. And then I thought, when did Jesse Glasgow go to Louisiana? Because he lived his entire life in the state of Tennessee. And so the more I researched, the more I found out that the Louisiana State Lottery advertised in many, many newspapers across the United States. And I found newspapers for our local area, which he would have seen and read, that advertised the Louisiana State Lottery. And in that advertisement, it tells the reader that you can purchase your lottery ticket at the local post office. So that's when I realized Jesse Glasgow purchased his ticket at the local post office. So this is actually his ticket. At the bottom, it gives his lottery ticket number, 92074. I subsequently have learned that the Louisiana State Lottery would also publish in the newspaper the winning lottery numbers. And so I'm actually on the hunt to see if I can find his winning lottery number in the paper. So far, I've not been able to find it. But the rabbit hole part of this is that I started researching the Louisiana State Lottery, and I found that this lottery was instituted and operated by two Civil War generals, General Beauregard and General Early. Now, this particular lottery, if you want to read something pretty fascinating, was very scandalous. And these two Civil War generals got into a lot of trouble with this lottery. And so that's all I'm going to say. If you want to research it, just go to Google, put in Louisiana State Lottery 1888, and you will go down the rabbit hole and read a bunch of great stuff about this lottery. It was pretty scandalous. Manuscript collections are behind closed doors. When you walk into an archive and into the research area where you sit down to do your research, you're not going to see these manuscript collections. They're behind closed doors. You're going to have to talk to the archivist about an index of their manuscript collections, or maybe the index is online on their website. And so that's something you're going to have to ask about. The most important part, other than the records themselves, of a manuscript collection is the finding aid. The finding aid is a document that is produced by the archivist while they are processing the collection, getting it ready for the researchers. It is like a roadmap to the collection. There's a lot of information included in a finding aid, but you need to read the finding aid to help you understand what the collection is about and whether or not there is something in that collection that you want to look at. This is actually a piece of a finding aid from a collection that we have in our archive. To me, the most important part of a finding aid is the contents listing. That's the folder by folder, box by box listing of what is in the collection. And so this is the Marie Stockard Records collection. This is the finding aid. And in folder 7, we've got correspondence, letter to parents from Talmadge dated May 25th, 1925. Now, I'm very fortunate in my archive that we have a small archive. I can take the time to list every single thing that's in every single folder. So in most finding aids, you're probably just going to find folder 7, correspondence 1925, and not a listing of what is in there. A lot of archives don't take the time to do that, and it's understandable because they have a lot to do. But the finding aid for a manuscript collection is going to give you the pieces of information that you need to know whether or not it's something you want to have request and brought to you and to look through. But these are normally all original documents, photographs, ephemera that you're going to find in these collections. So what can be found in manuscript collections? Diaries, letters, family genealogies, personal papers, business records, school records, but a lot of original documents, a lot of documents you're not going to find in any other collection. And so that's why manuscript collections are very important. Next, I want to talk about vertical files. Remember, I mentioned how I discovered vertical files. Sometimes these are also called subject files or morgue files in archives. Vertical files, they are a collection of miscellaneous documents, ephemera, and sometimes photographs. I've seen archivists put their photographs in vertical files, and then I've also seen them take their photographs and put them in one big collection. These vertical files are stored in file folders and in filing cabinets. They are normally indexed by surname or subject name, so that's easy for us to find our surnames, or if we're researching a particular subject, to find that subject. The index is either going to be maybe on their website, the archive's website. It may be a paper copy in the archives. It could be located on an in-house computer at the archives. And so you always want to get a hold of that index to see what the index has there. Vertical files are a hodgepodge of records. There are usually not enough in these files to produce a large manuscript collection, so that's why they're vertical files. They're almost always donated records from people who have walked in and donated records. I mean, I have people that'll walk in with a newspaper clipping, a local program to a local event that happened locally, and something else, and they'll say, do you want this? And yes, we'll want that, and we will catalog these and put these in the vertical files. I have found several things in vertical files that have helped me with my own research. So some interesting things that can be in vertical files are newspaper clippings. Now, many of our archives, their entire vertical file collection is nothing but newspaper clippings or obituary clippings. So that's a great place to find those. But you can also find family histories in vertical files, family group sheets, donated miscellaneous tidbits, photographs. I've said photographs can be in there. And I've also found copies of family Bible pages. You know, the little genealogical pages in Bibles that people would fill out. I've seen copies of those in vertical files as well. Here's some examples of some things in our vertical files. This is some applications. These are original applications for membership in the Sparkman Burial Association from 1933. For our area, the reason why these are extremely important to us is because the local funeral home here was the Wiseman Funeral Home. Mr. Wiseman owned it from the 1800s up to about 1977, his family. And he passed away. And of course, a lot of researchers, genealogy researchers and other researchers were constantly contacting his wife, wanting to see records from particular people's funerals. Genealogists do this all the time. And his wife thought that those records were business records and that they were not open to the public, and that why do people want to see these? So she told her daughter that upon her death, that her daughter was to destroy those funeral home records. When she passed away, her daughter did exactly what her mother asked her to do, and she destroyed all of those funeral home records. So for the genealogical and historical community, it was a great loss, but it was something that that family did. And so anytime we have any kind of funeral or burial records, to us, they're a great find because of that particular loss. Here's a family group sheet that is one of our files for the Cook family. I also encourage genealogists to donate or to send in to archives their family group sheets to put on file. And also put your name and contact information, because there may be researchers that come in and find this and they may contact you, and maybe you can make a connection and share family information. The next type of record collection is loose records. These are some of my favorite records to do research in and to process as an archivist. These types of records are found in almost every archive. These particular records in this photograph are loose school records in our archives. This is how we got them in these beautiful little boxes. But they're arranged alphabetically, but there was no order to them. But we got probably 16 boxes of records that look like this. These loose records are considered working papers or accompanying papers to those records that we found in bound volumes. And so when you're doing research and you find information in a bound volume, such as a marriage record, a court record, a last will and testament, you need to be thinking to yourself, I bet you there may be some other papers, some loose records or accompanying papers that are also in the archive concerning this court file or this estate. They're going to be archived separate from the bound volumes. If you get those bound volumes, those big books that are brought to you to look for records, there may be other records associated to whatever you find in that bound volume. I can tell you this, is that the information you find in the bound volumes is usually not the whole story. The loose records or the probate packets or court packets that have these loose records, they're going to contain additional information not found in those bound volumes. That's why it's important that we look for these other loose records and ask about them. So what kind of collections could have loose records associated with them? Well, obviously court records. You may find a court case that's mentioned in a bound volume, but there's going to be a court packet or a court loose record, and that's a file folder full of affidavits, subpoenas, witness statements, things like that, that's going to be in addition to what you found in the bound volume. We have a collection of marriage loose records. They're fantastic records. Probate records, that's probably the most known type of loose record in the genealogy and historical community. The probate records, you have your last will and testament you might find in the will book, but then these probate loose records would contain all of the working papers of that particular probate or estate. Deed records could have loose records, and then manuscript collections and vertical files that I just talked about are considered a type of a loose record. Here's an example of an estate or probate file. This is for Will Pulley from 1959. And in this file, you see everything. There's newspaper clippings about his estate. There's tax receipts. There's court records and things like that. None of this information is found in the bound volume. Many times the bound volume is a very short synopsis of a court case or just contains the last will and testament. This is the rest of the information that will help you understand an estate or a particular court action. Scrapbooks. Scrapbooks are my absolute favorite. I love to do research in scrapbooks, and I love to process them in the archive as an archivist. Almost always they're donated by individuals. Maybe there are scrapbooks for a particular local group, a civic group, a social group. We don't have it anymore, but we used to have the Garden Wheel Club here, and they used to do scrapbooks every single year, and I've got several of those in our archive. Each scrapbook is unique and one of a kind because it was produced by individuals. These scrapbooks could contain anything. I absolutely love scrapbooks. People would paste original records into scrapbooks. They pasted their own birth certificate in scrapbooks, or death certificates, or marriage certificates. And these could be found in scrapbooks. Many times these scrapbooks are archived with the manuscript collections. If they have come in with a collection of records from an individual, the rule is we keep it all together, and they are archived together. But I've also seen archivists where they've taken all of the scrapbooks from all the different collections and put them in one collection of scrapbooks. I've seen that done as well. So some nuggets that you might find in scrapbooks are actually original records that are pasted into scrapbooks. A lot of newspaper clippings. I've seen whole scrapbooks made of nothing but newspaper clippings. And that could be significant, because if you're looking for a particular article or an obituary or something in a newspaper, and you even look to the microfilm newspapers, and that particular issue you need was not saved and not microfilmed, you may find a clipping in a scrapbook. You can find old letters, greeting cards with names and addresses in old scrapbooks. Family photos are also in scrapbooks. And then if you're lucky enough, you might find those wonderful scrapbooks that have these documents in them, but the person who made the scrapbook actually wrote their memories or journaled or put in family stories on the actual pages, which those I love. So here's some examples from our archives of some scrapbooks. This particular one is the Brigham family scrapbook, and it's nothing but a newspaper clipping scrapbook. They clipped all kinds of stuff, birth announcements, death announcements, social events, things like that. But the very interesting thing about this particular scrapbook is the paper that they used for the scrapbook. Now, the Brigham family owned a local mercantile store in the 1800s in our area. And what they did is they took a local cash journal that they had and used it for scrapbooking. And so if you can barely see it, it's dated 1896. Underneath all of these newspaper clippings is actually their store journal, meaning they have a listing of everyone who bought whatever or had an accounts with their mercantile. And it's underneath all of these newspaper clippings. Well, the newspaper clippings are really pasted down pretty good, so I can't lift them off, but I wish they had not put them on there, because I would love to see the information underneath there. This scrapbook is one of my favorites. It's actually, it's the Evelyn Ellis scrapbook. It was found in a home during an auction, an estate auction. And when they found it, they donated it to the archives. Miss Evelyn Ellis collected everything and put it in her scrapbook. And then she journaled about it, which is fantastic. And so this is a Baby Ruth candy bar wrapper. You can't tell it from here, but it's about 3 times as big as the Baby Ruth candy bar wrappers of today. And then she journaled about it. She says, always remember June the 11th, 1938 at Beech Grove at the ice cream supper. She journaled about everything in her scrapbook. This one is pretty cool. It's an original Grand Ole Opry ticket from April the 1st, 1939. And then she journaled about attending the Grand Ole Opry in Nashville. I loved seeing this because it was a history touch point for me, because my husband's grandmother on his father's side and my husband's grandfather on his mother's side, before they married their spouses, they actually got together and tried out for the Grand Ole Opry. His grandfather played the banjo, his grandmother played the guitar. And so they didn't make it, but she told me the story. And so it was neat to see this ticket that would have been produced about the same time they were trying out. And the last one out of this one is, and it's amazing that it still survives, it's still intact, is she pasted this cigarette into her scrapbook. And she said it was a Mexican cigarette that her friend Kathleen gave her. And so fantastic stuff to be found in scrapbooks. School records. I find genealogists don't use, or historians don't use, school records as much as they should be. There can be school records for local schools, universities, military academies, and they can be found at any one of our local archives. They are fantastic records actually to do research in. The availability of school records may not be as prominent in some areas as others. It just depends on what was saved and what was thrown out. Many records are considered permanent, but a lot of these records are not considered permanent and they could have been thrown out. They're sometimes harder to track down where they're actually located. Sometimes they're still at the school board level. Sometimes they've been given to the local historical or genealogical society, or maybe the local county archive. And maybe they're still sitting in a building that nobody even knows about. About 3 or 4 years ago, our local school board called me, asked me as our county archivist to help them with some of their records. And they had a building that they didn't necessarily forget about the building, they just had forgotten what was in the building. And so I went and met with them at the building, and they had about 20 filing cabinets that were filled with school registers. These are the school registers that the teachers use to document grades, their students and things like that. But these dated back to the 1920s, when it was before school consolidation, before school integration. And it documented every single one of our little community one-room schoolhouses. So we were able to transfer all of those to the archives. They were actually going to throw them away. And we said, no, 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 these are historical. We need to keep them. And so it took us a year, but we finally got them transferred to the archives. School records can help to tell your ancestor's story or tell a story that you're telling in a historical perspective. If you have ancestors or people that did not go to school, you may still find them in the school records. And I'm going to show you an example of that. So what kind of things can you find in school records? Well, you can find student attendance, which to some researchers may be, well, I don't really care if my ancestor attended school, but it puts your ancestor in a place and time, especially if you're like me, and I like to document every step of my ancestors, where they went and when they were there. Student grades can be found. School board minute books. We have those dating back to 1895. This is one place you can find your ancestors who didn't go to school. And I say that because the school board minutes will list where they hired school bus drivers. So maybe your ancestor drove the school bus, but they never went to school. Maybe your ancestor as an adult with their children has a beef with one of the schools and they took it to the school board. And so maybe they're in there. So great to read school board minutes. If your ancestor was a teacher, you might find teacher contracts, again, bus driver contracts. If you're doing research on a local school, whether as a genealogist or a historian, this is where you're going to find some great information about those local schools and school photographs. I'm always looking for a photograph of the school that my ancestors attended. I haven't ever found very many of them, but they may be in the school records. Here's a great example of a school record. This is the Cave Orchard School enrollment records. We had some teachers here, Miss Lola and Laura Knight. They were actually twins and they taught school here for decades. And these records were actually donated from part of their personal papers to the archives. And so we were great to have them. This listed their boys on the right, girls on the left. Yeah, boys on the left, girls on the right. First grade, second grade, these were one-room schoolhouses. They taught several grades. But one of the real interesting things that I got a lesson out of by looking at this particular record is this. If you look in the first grade, you've got Willie and Ewing Musser, and they're 14 and in the first grade. And then you look over there to little Lydia Mae Bryant. She is 16 and in the second grade. After doing some research, I found out that not today, but back then, when you came to school, they would test you to see what grade level you were at. And didn't matter what your age was, whatever you tested at is where they placed you. And so that's why you've got 14-year-olds in the first grade and 16-year-olds in the second grade. I found that to be very interesting. It taught me that you need to look everywhere for your ancestors because they may not be where you think that they are. And this is the document I want to share with you to show you about your unschooled ancestors and how they can be in school records. This is actually a receipt. It was a miscellaneous receipt that I found in the school board records. And it says, please pay Conley Stringfield 4 days at $3 per day, $12 for building cabinets at the Stewart School at the home economics room. Now, I know for a fact that Conley Stringfield did not attend school a day in his life. And the reason I know that is because Conley Stringfield is my husband's grandfather. I knew Mr. Conley Stringfield. He was a fantastic man. He was a very intelligent man, even though he did not go to school. But in August 30th, 1941, he actually built the cabinets in the home economic room at the Stewart School. He was a carpenter. He was an extremely good carpenter. The thing that I did not know is that after I found this document, this has probably been 3 years ago when I found this document in our archives, And I showed this to my mother-in-law, who was Conley Stringfield's daughter. This actually happened before she was born. She was born in 43. When I showed this to her, she was flabbergasted because she attended the Stewart School as a child. She never knew that her father built the cabinets in the home economic room. Now, Conley Stringfield died in 2001, and so I was unable to share this with him, and we were not able to talk to him about it. But his daughter, my mother-in-law, was forever grateful that I showed her this document. So Conley Stringfield never went to school, but yet he has school records. So that's very interesting. Voting and election records are another type of record I encourage researchers to look for. They could be located at the election administration's office if they've been saved. Again, this is like school records. A lot of our election and voting records were not saved, other than maybe the election results, which are considered permanent record. Again, the availability may be difficult. So study the state retention schedules, knowing what was allowed to be saved, what was not allowed, what should be saved is something important. You can find the poll tax. Many of us know about poll tax. That's actually located in tax records. Voter registration lists, election records, results. Your ancestor may have been a poll worker. Maybe there's still poll worker lists that survive, candidate records, and voting district changes, which happened all the time. I know in Tennessee, we are actually in the midst of changing our voting district. It's called redistricting. We do it every 10 years here in Tennessee. Photographs in archives. All of our archives have them, depending on how they organize them and how they archive them, but they all have photographs. And so if you're looking for a photograph of an ancestor, you're looking for a photograph of a building, a school, a church, something that was in the area that you're researching, this is a great place to find them. Manuscript collections and vertical files is probably where you're going to find photographs. I have seen some archivists take all of the photographs that they have in their archives out of every collection and put them in their own collection, their own photograph collection. So it's important that we talk to our archivists about their collections and where things are located. Also, I want to talk about unidentified photographs. All of our archives have them. As these photographs are donated to us, a lot of them are not identified. So if you have photographs of known buildings, known people, take a look at these unidentified photographs. You may be able to help the archivist identify some of these photographs because you have some photographs that correspond with those, that have the same people in them, the same buildings in them, and that would be a great help to us archivists. Last one I'm going to talk about is unprocessed records. This one sometimes gets me in trouble with archivists, but like I said, being a genealogist coming into the archives world, this is something that I discovered. Unprocessed records, all archives have them. What are they? These are records that have been donated to the archives that are sitting on shelves, waiting to be processed and made available to researchers. Now, I'm an avid reader. I actually also like to listen to authors talk about their writing process, their research process. I've heard many authors talk about gaining access to unprocessed records at archives. So if they can gain access to these records, then why can't historians and genealogists gain access? I think it all comes down to showing the seriousness of your work, showing the archivist or whomever you're speaking with that you're serious about your research, and that developing that relationship with them, letting them know that you're not going to mishandle the records, and hopefully you can gain access. These again are donated records that are waiting to be processed. Most archives have a backlog of these records. They have records that have been sitting on shelves for years, waiting to be processed. This is another reason why I tell genealogists your research is never done, because there are these records sitting on shelves that you don't even know about that could have information about your ancestor in them. We should talk about to the archivist about these records. When these records come in, there's usually a cursory inventory done about what's there. And so the archivist may have an idea if you're talking to them about a particular family name, a particular area that you're doing research in. They may know that these records exist and will let you access them. Keep checking back with the archives to see if those particular records have been processed. I can tell you during COVID, many of our archives, even though they've not allowed patrons in, They have been working on a lot of records, either at the facility or from home. And so I think that once we come out of this COVID and once people start getting back into our archives, you're going to find that these archivists have been working really hard, and there's going to be a lot more records now available for research. Behind closed doors, most of our records are behind closed doors in what we call the stacks. And so you really need to talk to archivists, librarians, museum curators, those that are actually working with the records about what they have and what's available. The research area where you usually sit only has a small number of genealogical records, mainly reference records, books that are sitting on shelves. So the majority of what you're going to want to access are behind these closed doors. Again, talk to the archivist about your particular research request. Keep it short, keep it simple, and I think it'll be most effective that way. Build a relationship with the archives that you're working with. Like I told you about in Wyandotte County, Ohio, I've been researching there for 32 years. I'm still not done because that family lived there for over 100 years. And so I'm still uncovering records in that area. So websites, a lot of our archives now have websites. I don't know why, but a lot of them don't make it very easy for us to find their digitized records or their indexes. So you may have to click through a lot to find what you're looking through. Use the search feature on their website. It's not foolproof, but it might help you. Use the Ask the Librarian or Ask the Archivist button. I find that they're actually very quick to respond these days. Use the websites that archives share their and contribute their information to, such as Archive Grid, Internet Archive, things like that. And this is your reality check for the end of this presentation. Statistics say that only 5% of genealogical or historical records are online. That means that the rest of them are sitting on shelves in archives, waiting for us to discover them. So remember, it's not all online. Contact or visit an archive today. And please visit my blog, A Genealogist in the Archives, and you can find me on Facebook, The Archive Lady. Go like my page. And if you have any questions after this presentation, after this conference, please email me. My email address is also on the handout. I love getting email from those who attend my presentations. And with that, I think I made the time. I'm going to turn it back over to Karen for any questions if we have time for them.
Yeah, thanks, Melissa. I mean, you can stop sharing your screen in a little bit, or you can put your email in the chat. We do have a few questions, and I know we're at time, but I wanted to give people an opportunity because we do have a lot of people in the group who are our archivists around the state, and many people who do a lot of research in the archives. So wanted to get your feedback. Let's see. So Carol Gales asked if the archive court records are public, and Karen Gray, who's our state archivist, did say in Alaska most court records are public except for adoption.
Yeah, that's the same in Tennessee. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so and somebody asked about preserving. How do you process scrapbooks to preserve the contents?
Less is more with scrapbooks. And if any archivists that are here would like to chime in, but the way we do it is we keep the scrapbook like it is. One of the things we sometimes will do is we'll put archival tissue in between each page. So if it somehow gets exposed to moisture, they won't stick together. And then we take the entire scrapbook, put it in an archival box, and we put archival tissue paper in the box so it's covering it, and we put it in a climate controlled area. If you in your home, not all of us can live in archives, obviously, but if you keep your humidity levels and your temperature levels at a consistent and not fluctuating, it's much better for documents and for paper.
Okay, thanks. David Ramser asks about, can you speak to the accuracy of records involving oppressed people, like slaves in Tennessee? Have you found that those who kept those records tried to put a positive face on them? It's an issue we've seen here in Alaska in researching Gulag prisoners in the Russian Far East. And I would add to that, perhaps also with our Alaska Native community records.
Yes, I'll agree with that. And of course, it depends on who has produced the records. I'm actually currently reading a diary right now of, it's a Civil War diary, a young girl who is white and who owned, her family owned slaves. And so her diary is full of very positive things about her slaves, especially she has a personal slave. And so, and we all know that whoever's writing the history has got the upper hand. And so, yeah, I find that depending on who's writing it, who's producing the documents and how it's portrayed, I would agree with what that person said. Yeah, we have it here in Tennessee too with slave records.
And is there any way to handle that?
You know, the way I handle that is I document what's written. I mean, you can't change what's written, but you can also do more historical research. You can gather more information from, let's just say, from the enslaved, from other plantation records, from other enslaved memoirs, diaries, their letters, their documents that they, if they exist, to tell a fuller story. Just don't take one document, one story, and go with that.
Yeah, so putting it in historical context.
Absolutely.
Elizabeth Cook has a question comment. A problem for many counties in the lower 48 is a lack of funds. There is no money for archiving records, and many county courthouses are simply open to whoever wants to look and maybe take records. I guess that's more of a comment.
I like to comment on that though, because I told you the story about how our archives was formed. One of the reasons why we got together to do this was there was a local lady who was writing a book about her family history, and her grandfather had been murdered on the streets here. And so she was looking for the court records from 1921. She could see the records on microfilm at the library, but as all genealogists and historians want to do, we want to handle the original records. We get a thrill out of that. So she asked where the original records were, and they told her they're in the vault in the basement of the courthouse. So she went to the vault in the basement of the courthouse that was open for anyone to pilfer through to do anything with. So she was the one who put out the call to the historical community about preserving our records. And so that's how we got to do what we did. But yeah, a lot of these records are just open to whatever. One of the first things I did when I became the archivist is to get our vault combination lock fixed and it got locked.
Yes, and many archives have very strict security systems and, you know, alarms and all that as well. And somebody asked about your blog and if you could put
I just put the link in.
Okay, great. So Shanna asks about beyond donating funds and materials, can historians help the archives? In her experience, she told an archive that an Alaska village in old photos had changed its name, so providing new information. And another time, transcribing a handwritten document and then emailed that back to the archive. So therefore, they had a electronic version that, as you know, archives don't always have the money to digitize everything. So she says, are these things useful?
Absolutely. Any way that anyone can help an archive is fantastic, whether it's volunteering your time. And, you know, and I tell people when I ask for people to volunteer, I say, you don't have to volunteer for a year, an hour, you know, a day, but you can also volunteer your time, just like she talked about, transcribing records or doing index work, or helping us to digitize. It's great. Or maybe it's just sharing your knowledge. If you was born and raised in an area, you know, type up your history, type up what your oral history of what you know about the area and donate that to the archives. One of the things that we've got in our archives are some oral histories, World War II oral histories, and then we've got some local citizens who have done some oral histories. Our historical society did some on camera interviews. But if you have a history, you have a history. We all have history. And so, you know, tell your history and give that to the archive of what you remember, what you know about the area.
Well, and also that, you know, re-identifying things in photographs. There was a great example here in the last few months. There was a collection of photographs from somebody in, I want to say it was Germany or Holland. Maybe it was Holland. Anyway, that they found, you know, was from their parents who had traveled to Alaska and
yes,
all these photos, and they didn't know what they were. And they created a website, and that information got out. And because it's of Native people in the Yukon Kuskokwim area, and somebody from there saw that picture and they said, oh, that's me as a kid, or that's my auntie. And, they were able to help identify that information. And so that's connecting the people back to the material, and archives love that kind of stuff. And the Historical Society's been doing this big research guide on the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act, and we're going through collections and archives. And in some cases, the collections, are not fully indexed and cataloged and documented because it's just too much material. So our information is going to be returned to the archives to help them with their finding aids and their catalogs. And I know they are appreciative of that.
Absolutely.
So we are over time. But we really appreciate all this information, Melissa. That was very useful. And I don't know if anybody else has any pressing questions, or we can contact you directly through your email that you posted. Anybody else? And we're glad that we can help you learn a little bit about Alaska.
Oh, I'm just enjoying it, really. And so I'm looking forward to the rest of it.
Great. And Hild says, thanks. It was a great session. And I would agree. And yeah, the archives are there for people to do the research. So let's get out there.
Absolutely.
All right. Thanks. So we'll see everybody back here at 1:30 for, where are we? Oh, crossing international borders. So we will talk to everybody then. Bye.